Hello everyone, good afternoon or good morning depending where in the world you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. I can see we've got a busy room today, so lots of people with us, so hopefully it's going to be a very interactive session. We're always keen to hear your views as well as share our own. My name's Kathy Wellings, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director here at the London School of International Communication. We're really delighted today to be collaborating again with the British Swedish Chamber of Commerce. So thank you, Christina and the team, for supporting us again, and thank you to all members who've joined us. And we're also here in collaboration with the London School of English in Stockholm. So Anne Peel, who's our presenter, she's a friend and partner of our school there, and also a relocation specialist, and she'll be taking you through the session shortly. I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping with you very quickly before we jump into the session. So just a few reminders, a few check-ins. We are recording the session, and you will receive an email probably tomorrow with a link to that recording, so feel free to listen again, to share with any colleagues who might be interested in hearing the session. Unfortunately, we do have to mute you all. I think we've got around 50 people with us today, so we'll be doing all the talking, but that doesn't mean you can't join in. You've already found the chat, most of you, so Anne might ask you questions where you can reply there. We might also ask you to draw or write on the slides. Hopefully you can see on the left-hand side now there's a toolbar with a number of different icons. There's a T, for example, so if you click on that, you'd be able to then click on the slides if you want to have a play and just write something. There's also a pen if you want to do a little squiggle like I have. So we may ask you to do that later, but you always have the option of the chat if that's not available for you. I think that's everything really from my side. Do participate with comments, questions throughout. We're due to finish at 2 o'clock my time, so on the hour. We'll aim to finish on time, but we will allow some time hopefully for questions at the end. If you have burning questions throughout, just put them down. If we don't address them in the moment, we'll come back to them at the end. So I think that's all from me. I will see you all at the end, and in the meantime I'm really happy to have Anne Peel with us. She's going to share a lot of her practical insights and experiences with you. So Anne, I'll leave things in your very capable hands. Thank you, and enjoy the session, everyone.
Hello, I hope everybody can hear me. I'm assuming so. My name is Anne Peel. Thanks, Kathy, and for having me as presenter, and thanks also to Christina at the SCC. It's great so many of you could join us today. And hello from sunny Stockholm. Just a few words about me. I am originally from Ireland, as you may be able to hear. I've been in Stockholm for the last 20 years, and as Kathy said, I work as a relocation consultant. I also read the book Working in Sweden, the A to Z Guide, because I'm very interested in intercultural differences, having worked in a few countries, and basically that covers a lot of the stuff I wish people had told me when I first started working in Stockholm, and that's some of the stuff we'll be covering today. So our objectives for today are to learn more about the Swedish mindset, some unwritten rules of Swedish work culture, and also tips for building relationships with Swedish colleagues. So I hope you will get some actionable insights that you can take with you today that will make working in Sweden or working with Swedes a little bit easier. It would be great if we could start by getting a flavor of your experience in Sweden, just to see who is with us today. We have prepared a poll, so it would be great if you could just fill in the option which describes you best? Are you perhaps Swedish? Are you an expat living in Sweden, traveling regularly to Sweden on business, or perhaps working for a Swedish company but don't travel there, or just curious? Great. Everyone is finding the poll and filling it in. So it looks like we have quite a few Swedes, the majority of Swedes. How interesting. Well, then hopefully you will get some insights into an outsider view on what it's like to work in Sweden today, which I hope you find interesting. And we have some expats as well, and some traveling regularly to Sweden. So thank you for that. I'm just curious to see who you have with us today.
There's some interesting comments in the chat as well, Anne.
Aha, okay.
Some people don't fit the types as always.
Study lectured Swedish. Oh, great. How interesting. So we have a real mix and lived in Sweden before. Thank you very much for that. It's always interesting to see what your own experience of Sweden is. So if we just move along, that one. Your impressions of Sweden before we get started with the material we have, it would be really interesting to hear what your impressions of the Swedish are. If you could perhaps give one or a couple of words by filling it in the chat or using the tool on the side. Just the first thing that comes to mind. It doesn't necessarily have to be super positive. You may not have any impressions at all. That's what we're here for today, but it would just be interesting to hear. Okay, great. So direct. Okay, that's quite a common response. Good. Planning. Yes, absolutely. That's something I was going to talk about today. Efficient, private, modest, friendly. These are all quite common responses. Lagom, of course, also something we'll be talking about today. The Scandinavian buzzword, which has been doing the rounds for quite some time now. Lagom. Well, thank you very much for that. So, just move along. Some stereotypes of the Swedish. None of them, I think, came up there in your comments, but these are some common stereotypes of the Swedish. Everyone's tall and blonde, perhaps drives a Volvo and eats meatballs and shops at IKEA. Also, in the images here, we have the Swedish chef, which is someone who often comes up. He didn't come up in the comments today, from the Muppets, and of course, ABBA. I'm probably revealing my own age group here. Depending on your own age group, you may be more familiar with brands like Spotify, or in terms of music, maybe Avicii or Swedish House Mafia. But these are some stereotypes of the Swedish. Before we get started on values, I thought it would be interesting to show this, the cultural map of the world, which is a map that was devised by Engelhard and Welzel to political scientists, and it's based on the World's Values Survey, which was conducted over 80 countries. And it studies people's beliefs and values throughout the world. So we have two axes here. We have, on the left-hand axis, we have traditional values going up to secular rational values, so non-religious values. And on the bottom axis, we have survival values going all the way through to self-expression values. So what can we say about this map? Well, religion and wealth are the two main factors that influence cultural values around the world. So the influence of religion can be measured here on this axis between traditional values up to secular rational values, whereas the values of wealth can be, the influence of wealth can be measured on the bottom axis, from survival values through to self-expression values. So you may want to take a moment to locate your own country. Sweden, as we can see, is up here in the top, marked in red. So it might be interesting to see how culturally different you are placed from your country. Traditional values are, of course, the highest, as you can see, in Africa and Latin America. And secular, so non-religious values, are most marked in Japan and Protestant Europe, whereas survival values are most prevalent in Africa and former communist countries. And self-expression values score highest in English-speaking countries and Protestant Europe. So what's interesting to note here is that even within Protestant Europe, Sweden is out. It's quite extreme in these in terms of self-expression values and also secular rational values. So let's take some examples and talk about how this plays out. What sort of values are there in this self-expressive, secular, rational country of Sweden? What are typical Swedish values? Well, I'm going to go through a number. The first one I would like to start with is individualism. And this is very strong in Sweden, which often surprises a lot of people who associate Sweden with socialism. But individualism here is actually very strong. If we were to take some examples, one example, for example, is schools. Products and services, including schools, are marketed very much in an individualistic way in Sweden. So in Sweden, there are a lot of private schools which have come into the market, and they all profile themselves on different aspects. It might be languages, it might be sports, but they're all appealing very much to individual tastes, which is the way most products are marketed. And so you have a difference now. You have in schools, it's gone from an authoritarian position to students to being more like a service provider and a customer relationship. Another example of individualism is food and individualist tastes. If you're ever offering or preparing food in Sweden, whether it's at work or whether it's on a social basis, you are absolutely expected to ask for people's preferences. So do they need gluten-free? Do they need vegan? Do they need vegan? Do they need to cater to some imaginary or real tolerances? But this is absolutely expected. And indeed, if you don't ask, people will tell you, by the way, this is what I need. It's quite common. Even if you go over to alcohol, you're expected to cater with different tastes, from non-alcoholic to low alcoholic to regular alcoholic, organic. Individualism is key. Another good example is sweets, candy. Swedes are perhaps the highest consumers, the biggest consumers of sweets in the world. And what's really popular here is pick and mix. So any sweet, any corner shop worth its salt will have its own pick and mix selection in its own little shop, so that you can have your individualized sweets. So they're just some examples. We talked about religion on the cultural map. So just circling back to that, how does religion play out? What would be examples of how that plays out in Sweden? Well, generally religion is not discussed. It's seen very much as a private matter. In fact, if someone were to be described as religious, that's almost a bit like saying, oh, that person's a bit odd. Um, Generally, people don't talk about religion, and bringing up the subject might make them feel uncomfortable unless it's clearly in the context of a celebration like Christmas or a wedding or confirmation that's happening in a church. Confirmation, in fact, is another good example of individualism within religion. Kids in Sweden make their confirmation, if they're going to make it, at about the age of 15 or 16. It's held quite separate to the school. It's religion is a private matter. It's done outside of school. So just because you have been baptized, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be go on and do confirmation. It's a choice. And the Church of Sweden goes in and markets that heavily, confirmation, to get their new recruits on board. So it's never just a confirmation course. It might be you sign up for confirmation and pony riding, or confirmation and a 2 weeks language course in England to maximize your time. So that would be examples of how religion is individualized. If there is a religion in Sweden that's really worshipped, I would actually almost say it's nature. Nature is considered to be really important. Swedes love to get back to nature, to spend time in the country. Just to give an example of its importance, even in a non-countryside sense, if you're selling an apartment or a house, that would always be included in the ad, how far the apartment or the house is to nature. It's also really common to have a country house. So Swedes love to spend summertime out in the countryside, getting back to nature, restoring that work-life balance, and often very much back to nature. It's quite common not even to have indoor plumbing. So there's a hot tip for you. If you are lucky enough to get an invite to someone's country cottage, you might want to check out if they have indoor plumbing. Otherwise, a week in back to basics might be a bit much for you. But again, nature is really important in Sweden. In terms of another form of religion, I'd say something that runs a close second is training. Training in any form, whatever you're into, whether it's going to the gym or jogging or skiing, is really important. There's a huge emphasis on it. Swedes' image is important. They like to look good, and training is practiced almost religiously, I would say, in some people's cases, and discussed enthusiastically. So both training and nature are considered important elements in work-life balance, which, as I mentioned, is another value which is held very dearly by Swedes. Just to move on the pictures, this is a meme which I thought was interesting. You may have seen this. It's been doing the rounds on the internet. And the point I wanted to make here is how Sweden is well known for equality and political correctness. Sweden has a long and renowned history of supporting equality, whether it's workers' rights, women's rights, children's rights, animal rights, as in the case of the seagull here. And equality is important, not something to be joked about. Another tip. So jokes about women and equality in the workplace do not go down well here. To give you an example of children's rights that often surprise people, for example, is slapping. Any form of corporal punishment is absolutely forbidden here, both in schools and in homes. It's actually a punishable offence. So I bumped into a Syrian refugee here recently. And I was very amused to hear he said he'd actually never heard of political correctness until he came to Sweden. So he didn't know what it was, but he certainly got a crash course in it since he moved here. So political correctness, forward thinking, is something that Sweden is well known for. Gosh, I've been talking a lot. If has anyone heard of Greta Thunberg? Perhaps have we a show of hands? Is anyone still awake? Yes. Oh, good. Someone's typing. Greta Thunberg is the Swedish schoolgirl who started a school strike for climate change. So another forward thinker, also arguably very politically correct. Another word, Swedish word that's been doing the rounds recently on the internet, that's been becoming a bit of a buzzword, is flight shame. Has anybody heard of that? Flight shame? Yes, someone is saying a couple of people. Well, for anyone who doesn't know what flight shame is avoiding flying, or at least avoiding talking about it out of embarrassment that of the carbon footprint that you're leaving behind. Another example of Swedish forward-thinking political correctness, plugging. Has anybody heard of that? Yes? Plugging? Something else that's become a bit of a buzzword. And again, for anyone who doesn't know, plugging is the activity of jogging and picking up trash at the same time. So whatever your views, Sweden usually leads the way in trends. They're a modern, forward-thinking country. And even though some of these concepts are laughed or even ridiculed at first, they do tend to catch on. Just look at Greta Thunberg and the revolution she has started. The last picture I have within Swedish values for you is this one. And I wanted to bring up the word lagom, which a couple of people have already kindly brought up in the chat and at the beginning. So obviously a lot of you, obviously the Swedes know, but a lot of people have also heard of lagom, a Scandinavian word that's become a buzzword. Lagom, for anyone that doesn't know, is the concept of moderation, being just enough. So think of it as the Goldilocks of words. Not too little, not too much, just right in the middle. Now, lagom is a widely used context, and in fact, we could have a whole webinar about lagom, its different interpretations and its different applications. But the point I really wanted to make here is that it's an important concept used in Sweden, so much so that it's used in these political campaign posters. So the picture, "Make EU lagom again," are posters which are currently adorning Swedish bus stops and train stations all around the country in the run-up to the EU elections. And the slogan they have chosen in English, which is a first I've seen, "Make EU lagom again," is their slogan. Just to put my cards on the table, I'm not a Brexiteer. This is not me doing some sort of campaign about the EU, nor am I a supporter of the Christian Democrats, the party behind this. I just wanted to bring up the point about lagom and what an important concept it is in Sweden. So we've talked about general values in Sweden. Here, now if we talk about some key values in the Swedish workplace, here we have a list of them that I have prepared. if I were to lift one of these as perhaps the most important, or the most prevalent, it's egalitarianism. And I say that because egalitarianism is very much, um, it's very important in Swedish society, but also in the workplace. Sweden is famous for its hierarchies, flat hierarchies, and egalitarianism I lift because it pretty much runs into all the other words. It's the other values that are listed here feed into egalitarianism. Consensus orientation, team building, working with other people, that you have to compromise, you have to collaborate. And consensus is really the value that sets Sweden apart from most other countries. I would say pretty much every other country. This emphasis on consensus and gaining consensus, anchoring decisions within the workplace. The other value here that I would like to highlight is modesty, and the importance of humility, modesty in the Swedish workplace and indeed in Swedish society. Now this has its roots partly in Sweden's socialist history, but it also had in Sweden's cultural history. The law of Jante is a famous law, which is often brought up as an example. And the law of Jante is basically a code of conduct, which is prevalent in the Nordic countries, and especially Sweden. And the law of Jante essentially means, if you were to boil it down to one point, it's that you shouldn't think that you are better than anybody else. And it's sort of a negative view on individualism and individual success. So that's very much in the cultural background of Sweden. And that plays out in the workplace, that you should be modest and humble. And this is a common struggle for a lot of expats when they come to Sweden. How do you find your way, and how do you find how do you strike the right balance in a flat hierarchy where there are no clear directives and you're supposed to get on with your work independently and get consensus? Plus, how do you make a good impression when you're supposed to be humble, have a humble approach, and you're not supposed to stand out in any way? So that leads me on to my next point, the top 5 challenges for internationals. As I said, I work as a relocation consultant, help people move all the time. And these are challenges which come up time and time again, the most common challenges that newcomers usually encounter at work in Sweden. But before we get into that, perhaps we could get some feedback from you. What challenges, if you're an expat here or if you've worked here, what challenges have you experienced in the workplace? What do you think these top challenges might be? Is there anybody who would like to comment on that? Again, you could use the chat. Oh, good. People seem to be typing. We'll just wait and see what that is. The language barrier. That can be one. Too much structure, fear of confrontation. That's one that comes up quite often. And yes, speed for decision making. Sense of humor. All of these I've heard, yes, they come up. Slow at making decisions. And meetings, yes, death by meetings. Yes, thankfully we've agreed on an X, yeah. There are lots and lots of meetings, and that's something I'm going to be talking about now. What else have we got? Not from experience, but I've heard that it's hard to build relationships with your colleagues. Yes, that's something we're going to be talking about. Great. Sounds like working in Japan. That's interesting. Well, as we saw on the cultural chart, we're in many ways on the same, we have a lot of similar cultural values. So that's not surprising. So thank you very much for that feedback. Perhaps I can go on. We can talk about this a bit more later, but if I better push on time-wise with the ones which I had prepared. And number one, meetings, as you mentioned, arranging meetings. So the Nike logo doesn't really work too well in Sweden, at least not when it comes to meetings. Sweden is not it may be many things, but a spontaneous country. It is generally not. Planning is big and planning is expected. So what are the specific challenges of arranging meetings? Well, as some people already brought up, the consensus process, and there are many meetings. It's very often can seem like death by meetings. We talked about the importance of consensus, anchoring decisions, and it's very hard to achieve that without having a lot of meetings. So that's the reason behind the meetings culture. Another thing that surprises people a lot is the time frames necessary for doing things. Time frames are often longer than people expect, and that's partly because of the many meetings that you need to hold in order to get any project off the ground, but also sometimes because of holidays. Now, it's important to note that Swedes take their holidays very seriously. Holidays are pretty sacred. So if you're going to work here, or if you're going to be working with Swedes, then you really need to get a grasp on the working calendar and holidays and how they work. There are a lot of holidays throughout the year. And the most important, and people do not work in the interest of work-life balance. When it's a holiday, people are not working. So you should know that. And people expect that their holidays should be respected and that time off will be respected. The most important point within holidays is to know that the summer is not just a 2-week holiday. The summer is it's not just another season. It's a whole occasion. So Sweden pretty much closes down in the summertime. And not just for a couple of weeks in July. July is the biggest holiday month. But Sweden pretty much closes down from midsummer, which is kind of the last week, depending on when midsummer falls, from about the last week in June through to mid-August. And it's really important to understand that if things haven't happened for the holidays, they're not going to happen during the holidays. People are off on their way and they expect their time to be respected. And people plan around these holidays. So if you have a project which you hope to start in May, then you need to be aware that nothing really is going to happen during the summer. Also on the subject of holidays, we have bridging days. Has anybody heard of bridging days or knows what that is? See, somebody is typing. No? Well, oh, we've got a few yeses there. A bridging day is a literal translation of the word klämdag in Swedish. And it means if there is, for example, a public holiday midweek, say there's a public holiday on Thursday, let's say Ascension Thursday, a big public holiday, that people take the in-between day off so that they're not going to come in on the Friday. Now, this used to be taken for granted. Current legislation dictates otherwise, but your employer will normally give you an annual email dictating the policy on that. But you can expect that people to be off on the in-between day as well. So that's important to know if you've got a project underway. The other thing that people, a lot of expats really struggle with is, and are surprised about in Sweden, is what are acceptable absences. So if you're trying to arrange a meeting and people say, well, I can't because of whatever, what is considered acceptable? So, and this is something again that a lot of expats struggle with. So for example, parental leave is very long here, and it's shared by both men and women. It's not just women who go off on maternity leave, but it's not just parental leave. It's even when you're back at work, if your children are sick, it is allowed, and it is your right as an employee to be off with that sick child. And a lot of people struggle to, and especially bosses, if you have staff working for you, or indeed if you're just trying to arrange a meeting. Sometimes people think, oh, they're having me on, this is a joke. But no, these are acceptable absences. So the caring for a child is actually a verb, vabba. And a new one that's been doing the rounds is vava, which is the abbreviation for caring for a puppy. Because of course puppies too are individuals, and if you've got a new dog, they have their rights and need to be looked after too. So the point really is you need to know what employee rights are, and if someone gives you what you think is a joke of an excuse, it may be that it's a perfectly acceptable absence, and this is quite normal here. Attending meetings, challenge number 2. What this picture, I have to say, is slightly wrong. Could anyone suggest what seems slightly odd about this picture in a Swedish sense? Paper? Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, good one. All men? Was it all men? I actually thought it was a woman. That wasn't the intention. But no phones. Yes, all very good points, dress code. What I was going to make, all very relevant points. The point I was going to make is personal space. They all seem to be sitting very close to each other, which would, these people, if they were to sit that close in Sweden, they must know each other really well. Personal space is big in Sweden, and people seem to have a need for a larger amount of personal space than in other countries. So if you come in and you sit down, somebody else enters the room and typically sit at the other end of the table. You don't smell. It's just a greater need for personal space. Here are some terms which are appreciated and not appreciated, points that you can bear in mind when attending meetings. There are lists there. The one I would really highlight here is humility. We talked about it before, but it is really important not to go in and shout. A more humble approach, to go in and to listen in, goes down a lot better. The softly approach. Swedes don't tend to go in and declare their opinions. It would be more normal to point out perhaps pros and cons, or to suggest different alternatives rather than I think this or I think that. That would be generally tends to go down a bit better. Starting and finishing meetings on time are very important, not just the starting, because it's meetings planned all day, so you have to get on to your next meeting, and if decisions haven't been made during that meeting, then you're just going to have to book in another meeting. That's the way things work. Also keeping to the point, that important work-life balance. Don't go off on a tangent because people want to go home on time. So these are some points to bear in mind. The next challenge that people often find is effective communication. What goes down very well in Sweden is to be concise and to be short and to the point. Now, a lot of expats will actually struggle with this at the beginning. If you're used to a more fluffy tone of email and niceties, hello, how are you, lots of filler words, that's not the way things work here. You should know that's not going to be appreciated as a style, because being concise and to the point is what's appreciated. It's seen as respecting people's time. But also to know, if someone sends you an email, just say hey, not hey Anne or hey your name. They're not trying to be rude. That's just the way it does. So if you want to take the positive spin on that, it's really good that you don't have to worry about how to start an email. So you don't need to agonize over, how will I start this email? Shall I say hi? Shall I say dear Mr., dear Miss? Hey works. Really simple, really effective. Sorry, my mouse has just dropped off the table here. Just get that back. There. Okay. Effective communication. Just to give you an extreme example, this is actually a death notice. This is a real death notice. And what it says here is this guy, Stig Chanel, is dead. And it says, "Jag är död." I am dead. That's the death notice. And then that's where he died, and the date. So short, effective communication. I first saw that one in 2014. I've seen that exact style used actually several times since. The next challenge I wanted to bring up was Fika. I don't know, did someone bring it up in the chat already? I think somebody did, but Fika is, anyone who's been in the country more than 10 minutes knows what Fika is. Could we have a show of hands? Does anyone know what Fika is, or does everyone know what Fika is? Yeah. Okay, well, Fika as, thank you. Oh, well, some knows. Fika, as the picture suggests, is coffee. Is coffee and cake, or coffee and a sandwich. So Fika, there is a very big and strong coffee culture in Sweden. Fika is really important. Fika can be at any time of day. It can be just coffee. It can, as I said, it could be coffee and cake. It could be coffee and a sandwich. And what's really important to understand here is that you need to prioritize this, because this is a way of relationship building. So what to say about Fika? Fika is, as I said, relationship building at work. It's all about catching up with your colleagues and getting to know them in a more informal setting. And a common mistake that a lot of newbies in Sweden make at work is, rather than joining in the Fika, which might be once a day, it might be twice a day, it might just be one large Fika once a week for everyone, but they make the mistake of trying to make a good impression by staying at their desk working rather than joining in. Whereas actually it's the opposite that goes down better. You should be in there building relationships. So do prioritize that. Also, how another challenge people sometimes face is how to act at Fika, what to talk about. Well, one thing I often tell to people is go up, introduce yourself. If people are standing around, they're not necessarily always good at including you. So if you were to go up to a group of people, I would say, "Hi, I'm Anne. What are we talking about?" Rather than waiting for people to say, "Yes, I'm John and I'm Mary, and we're talking about so-and-so." So go up, take the initiative, introduce yourself. Also, don't dominate the conversation. That's really important. Back to egalitarian Sweden, everybody should be allowed to have their say, and it's seen as poor form, bad style to dominate the conversation too much. Another thing people sometimes struggle with is, what are appropriate topics of conversation? Um, well, anything too too personal is to be avoided. Religion and politics, that's not unusual. That's the case in many countries. But Swedes do tend to keep their their private and their personal lives separate. So avoid the personal. One thing that usually works very well is measurable facts. So because measurable facts are they're not opinions, they're just measurable facts. So for example, questions like how many, how far. For example, if you say, I am from Enköping, how far is that from Stockholm? What's the population? These are the sort of questions Swedes often like to ask. Um, even swimming, just about measurable facts. Swimming, uh, water also always has an exact temperature. So if you're talking about swimming, a question would be, how warm was the water? And then an exact answer is required, not just it was freezing or it was quite pleasant. An exact temperature is the normally exact answer, like it was 22 degrees or it was 26 degrees, whatever it happens to be. We're running out of time, so I better push on. The last challenge that people often struggle with that I'd like to bring up today is connection. And someone did actually bring that up, or a number of people brought that up earlier on, building relationships. And unfortunately, this is true. Now, Sweden scores incredibly well on all sorts of criteria. Sweden gets top ratings across the board from all sorts of criteria, from work-life balance through to equality in the workplace, clean and safe environment. But in expat survey after expat survey, it consistently gets a very poor rating on connection and the ability to make friends. So the important point to take here is that back to time frames and expectations, things might take a little bit longer in Sweden than in other countries. Swedes are reserved, they take time to get to know, and it might take longer to break in than you are used to. Yeah, the next slide I had was just quickly some tips on relationship building with Swedes, as it is difficult. Just to finish up with that, what are good ways of going about building relationships with Swedes? What goes down well? Well, Fika, we've talked about at length. Anytime, any place, anywhere. And it's important to know that it's not just Fika at work, it's also in a social context. So if you're starting off with someone, taking things slowly, Fika is usually the best way to go. Fika, a cup of coffee, it's much less of a commitment than, say, going for drinks or maybe going for dinner. Also, let's say someone asks you out for a Fika. Is it a Fika? Is it a date? If it doesn't go well, it's just a Fika. So much less of a commitment. AW, pronounced avia, something Swedes talk about a lot, and that stands for after work, which is essentially drinks after work. Now, unlike, say, in Britain, where drinks after work might be, oh, I'm going down to the pub, are you coming? This is much more an organized thing, organized often weeks in advance of the event. Might be up in posters when you go along, unless the company is providing at the bar, you would be expected to pay your own way. That's very important. Back to this independence, not feeling or being under obligation to anybody else. The third point for relationship building, quickly, networking. Any networking event you can go to, grab that opportunity and go. And back to punctuality, make sure that you get there on time, because people will always get there on time. They may even get there early. So if the networking event is starting at 5, be there at 5. It's not a suggestion. It's not, well, I'll turn up about 6:30. People will still be there. They won't. And then förening is the Swedish word for association. And there is basically a förening or an association for everything in Sweden. So whether you are into skiing or knitting, whatever your event, there is a förening for it. So go and join in with that. That's a really good way of getting to know people. And the final point I wanted to make in relationship building was organized activities. Swedes tend to feel more comfortable, especially if it's people they don't know well, socializing around an organized activity. So there is a purpose to something. They know what the deal is. There's a purpose to this. They know what the start time is. They know what the finish time is. They know what's involved. Is there going to be food? That tends to go down better than just a spontaneous hanging out with people. So generally, reach out, organize yourself, and take it slowly would be my advice. So we're running out of time. So just top 5 tips to finish up with. Time frames, a quick recap. Time frames are often longer, and planning really is essential. Sweden, again, is not a spontaneous country. So get your diary out and get organized. Always use or try to use an egalitarian approach. Expect consensus and compromise. Think humility, think team rather than individual. Concise communication is appreciated, can be very time-saving. And if you get abrupt emails, don't let it scare you. You haven't done anything wrong. That's just normal communication. Punctuality, very important. And the last point is to exercise restraint. Humility, body language, don't do overstrong reactions to get upset about something, to start using body language. If you're very positive, that can be charming. If you're upset and waving your arms around, that doesn't go down well. That's seen as hysterical behavior. It does not go down well. So they are my top 5 tips for working with Swedes. I hope you found them useful. Perhaps we could go over to, if you have any questions now, or Kathy, did you want to link back in?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Anne. That was fascinating. And I've been to Sweden a couple of times, but there was so much I didn't know. I know some people have to head off for meetings now, but we'll be on the line for a few minutes if you do want to ask any questions. And I just actually had a question, Anne. I know someone referenced at the beginning this feeling that the direct communication feels like constant criticism. And I personally, as a very indirect Brit, I found that quite tricky. And how do you know if someone, if the default is that people are direct, how do you know when that has actually veered into criticism or something negative rather than a kind of neutral direct style? Does that make sense?
I think very often Swedes are very direct when it comes to organizing practical matters. So we're doing this,
not really.
Point. It's just like, okay, this is the meeting place. There's no asking people for opinions. So organizing practical things, they tend to be very direct. Chop, chop, chop.
Talk about in all our training, reading
I think
lines.
less so generally when it comes to offering opinions, actually. So it depends on the context and what you mean by directness. Did you have a particular context in mind?
Sure. That makes sense. Wonderful,
I think
thank
it
you.
depends on the
I'm not sure
context.
if any
It can,
questions
we're
are
doing this,
coming
you're
through, so
doing
I
that,
just thought
do
I'd
that. It can
mention
be very like, which
our
is very
next
direct,
webinar that
but
we have coming
I
up
think
in July. You
generally
can see the
that
details
would be
here on
my
the screen. So we're
interpretation
going
of
to
it.
be looking
Generally,
at
it's more
using
in
English as an
organizing
international
practical
language,
matters
so how to
rather than
become
you are
fluent
this
in
or you
global
are
English. But
that
we'll be
of
sending out an
opinions.
invite nearer the
I
time, so do
be
look
my
out
view
for
of
that.
things.
And if no one has any other questions, I think we'll wrap up. Stay in touch. If you do have questions after the event, feel free to contact me or anyone here in the team. I think you have our email addresses. Follow us on social media if that's your thing. And otherwise, hopefully, we'll see you on another event soon. So thank you all for your participation, and thanks again, Anne. That was a really great session, and I think it generated a lot of interest, a lot of comments. So let's carry on the conversation. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.